when we're going to see them and where we're going to see them throughout the course of a day. And if they fall into a prospect category for us, it would be natural to think we should reach them as early as we possibly can. But perhaps 7:35 in the morning is not contextually in their life the right time to speak to them. Perhaps really 8 o'clock is the best time of day. And so by analyzing that individual and giving a propensity score to the best time of day to reach them, you'd get the machine to do the work of figuring out, estimating how many times you're going to see that person every day, and then within that estimate figuring out what the right time, what that right moment is to influence somebody to make a decision. And if you vet that out against your own ROI, you have the opportunity to begin to learn from it and begin to program the machine to look for more people at the right time to deliver the action you want to do. So what is programmatic buying? From a traditional standpoint, buying was always bought in collective ad placements, in groups, in advance, with a lot of lead time, and the opportunity to show one generic message to one group of consumers with a shared interest, maybe that demographic interest, maybe a lifestyle interest, and then in a generic content category, not super specific. What programmatic does is in two ways. It starts off with programmatic buying that, again, focuses on buying that individual, not that group, buying it in real time. So you analyze real market conditions, real factors, that time of day. Is the morning bad? Is the evening good? For the opportunity to show a more specific message to that specific consumer with a more specific context. You hone that context. You hone that messaging down to something that matters. That's the operational piece. And then the second one is, there's a question in red above. Are you optimizing against that? You're making messaging more relevant at a more relevant time against a more relevant consumer. Are you using the learning from that to make it even work better over time? And that's really kind of the key. An anecdote that I'll share along this approach is that the left-hand side of planning in advance was very much in the past was a very message-heavy type of communication. So, for example, my first job out of college was I worked on the Chevrolet retail media group, working on retail dealer association advertising. And the interesting thing is that if we had a 60-minute long meeting with a dealer board, for example, to go over creative and a communication plan, 55 of those minutes were spent talking about creative concepts, storyboards, all the things that go along with messaging in a TV-centric world. And the last 5 minutes, the client would turn and say, or the clients would turn and say, okay, where are we going to run this stuff? And so the question about the audience and the context of where the message would be shown was very much minimized in the meeting. It's completely flipped in today's environment, where the key conversation is all around who are we talking to, and all the characteristics of audience and the contextual approach and the right time to reach them, where the back part of that 5-minute conversation at the end is, okay, what are we going to tell them, or what are we going to message them? So it's almost flipped in time in terms of the approach that people have taken in the space. So programmatic has made it very audience-centric. I think the great part of the innovation, and I'll talk to it a little later in the deck, is that the message component is sliding back to being half of that conversation, because realistically who the person is and the time and place to talk to them is one half of it, but that message and that interactive experience is critically important. So I think we're sliding back to closer to a 50-50 message and audience world, and that's a really, really good thing. And I think that's the encouraging thing that I see in the programmatic space. The machine is enabling us to be able to do that, to be able to decision a message that matches the individual. An example of how programmatic buying is effective is that we're human beings and we have a ceiling on how much decision-making power we have. Yet we live in a world where we can pull so many different levers today in terms of being able to combine and build audiences that our capabilities have outstripped our ability to think about it. And I'll give you an example here. If you start with some basic targeting buckets, let's say we start with gender and we start with 2 buckets of groups there, and then we layer in age buckets, and say we have 7 of those. Then we layer in household income and have another 8 different groups across that. And then we layer in geographies. And in automotive retail, geographies are very, very important. So we have the whole of the United States, in this case, layered in here. And then we layer, and I'm keeping it simple here, let's just pick 4 basic digital channels: mobile, display, online video, and digital social advertising. So 4. There are many more channels you can activate against, but let's talk about those. You can activate against those channels. You live in a world where basically you've got 94,000 combinations. That's more than any one person can think about. If you layer it into even more, let's say you add 100 interest categories, now you're getting into the type of math that only Alfred Whitehead could think about. He was the only person who had the capability to think that big, which is why even he realized that we had to automate things in order to make it work better. To give it in perspective, that's basically counting all the grains in the sand, grains of sand on the earth twice, and so that is a very key consideration to have, is that no human, no planning team, no single organization can really wrap their head around all the options that are available to them today. So it's a better world to be able to program the machine to do the work and allow the human to review whether or not it's driving against the key business goals. So again, linking back into what I mentioned earlier about make sure you tie everything you're doing back to a real world business objective. Why is programmatic buying effective? Well, it allows you to narrow, when done correctly, you increase your effectiveness by narrowing it down to the customers you want. Who are the ones whose consideration you're going to move, and the ones who are never going to consider you? Well, take them out of the picture. Give them in context that generate impact. Avoid the 7:30 in the morning if the 7:30 in the morning doesn't work. And you layer all of this prospect information and all this data to better hone a message against those folks as well. When can it be used? Well, we think about it today, and where it's largely employed today is in this middle piece here, the direct response piece. It's very effective at prospecting and finding folks, retargeting people who are already intending your brand, driving offline impact in terms of measuring it to an actual sale or lift or driving some form of incrementality. But it works across the funnel. If you think about it from a branding perspective, you can measure your reach and your frequency and make sure you're hitting your effective communication goals. You can drive brand equity. You can shift attitudinal measures as well. It doesn't just have to be DR. You can actually program the machine to demonstrate and show through the right types of surveying approaches, for example, that you've lifted consideration or favorability or retail purchase intent. Those are attitudinal measures that can be programmed into the machine. And then the other part of it, and I'll talk to it a little bit later, is all throughout the life cycle. Loyalty marketing is huge. The opportunity to use programmatic to reach out and talk to existing owners. And I'm thinking, for example, around service, especially with such high service defection rates today to third parties. There's an opportunity to programmatically reach those people at the right time in a manner to bring them back into the dealership. So not only to drive service revenue, but holistically across both brand and retail to get that person back in talking to a human representative of the brand, getting them in there to be upsold and retained into a new vehicle. So it's not just the short term of driving them in to get the repair order, although that's great, but it's also retaining them in the long term as a customer. And programmatic can be used heavily in that space as well. What are the primary channels? Well, today, a lot of the decisioning happens in the channels that are exchange-based and digital. Display advertising, mobile advertising, digital video, social channels. Those are a lot of key ones. How do you find success? Well, if you think about the way that we manually do a lot of targeting today, this prescriptive approach, you can start with target segments and groupings of data that you may have, research information that you have. You can go and buy data, third-party data, for example, that surround those segments. And then you can build a tactic for each one of those, and if you find that audience is big enough, you can expand it by doing lookalike modeling, and then you can manually shift the budget in between tactics. But that gets into that counting the grains of sand issue again, because the more complex and the more you want to make it, and most people want to make it more complex when they have the tools put in front of them, the harder it gets just because it is so labor-intensive to do it. From a programmatic perspective, this goes back to, if you start with an objective and test across all sorts of different segments from an automatic perspective and looking for the segments that deliver audiences, that allows you to spend more of your time refining your customer model and moving your budget around to things that actually drive ROI. So think of it as using programmatic to do all of the testing for you, and then you reallocating based on what tests succeed. So again, it's allowing the machine to do a lot of the heavy lifting and to do the work. Where does this mean from a more automotive approach? Let's start with some more defined segments, because they're always good places to start. So if we're looking at people who are new vehicle intenders, for example, if you begin with retargeting, which are people who are intending your own models that you've seen on your own website, that's a great opportunity to start with people who like your brand. It's a no-brainer. Then you layer in buying third-party data around a specific segment of vehicle, expand it out to maybe your custom conquest groups as well. And then, for simplicity's sake, I'm expanding it out to other general in-market data. This is data that we know that people are intending a vehicle, and they know they're shopping for a vehicle, but they are not, they don't have a preference, we don't know yet, but we know they're in market and there's value in there and we can sift through it and go from there. But then there's this much larger universe that exists out there of people who are new vehicle prospects who we want to target, but we don't have any of our own first-party data on them. We don't have any third-party data on them because they haven't hit a threshold where they show up in the blue area yet. So how can you work within that space? And that's obviously starting with what I mentioned on the page before, which is starting with the business objective, going out and doing massive testing to find the people who drive the real ROI. Add that to the prescriptive targeting that you have within your existing segments. The objective here is to get the whole pie. So if you can take the defined segments where you know something about them and you have data, you can use that as a starting point, then model everybody else in the universe based on real ROI. You can get to a model where you can approach as close to 100% of relevant shoppers as possible, and with an understanding secondarily of where those people fall in the customer journey. And so those are really key elements of, we're all thinking about new vehicle intenders all the time. We want to reach them. How can we move forward and reach them in a way that seeks to put the right message in front of them and also seeks to get as close to 100% of the relevant audience as possible while screening out all the inefficiencies that we might find in a more broader prescriptive segment targeting approach. Insights, what can you find from programmatic? Obviously, you can learn a lot of things about people. You can learn about their household characteristics, their geographic characteristics. There are a lot of byproducts of finding success because as you're driving ROI, you can go back and look and say, okay, who drove the ROI? And you can bring those insights to other pieces. You may learn things about your target that you didn't know. You may develop new targets that you didn't know you had. You can use that to influence what you do from an offline planning perspective, what you do from a television perspective. It can also influence heavily your messaging. What messages resonate with people? What should we do more of? It's a great opportunity to test messaging and understand how things work. Some examples from an automotive perspective, we took internally within our organization of all the automotive campaigns that we run, we took a look at all the creative that runs within campaigns and found general insights based on creative. What has a clear link to ROI? KPI. Oh, hello. You may have me. You should have me back now. Sorry, we had a short technical glitch there. But anyway, what I was saying was we've learned some very specific insights creatively about what works and what doesn't work from a messaging perspective. First of all, viewers prefer white backgrounds in their ads. They tend to tie much more to ROI with a white background. Sorry, another technical issue.
Okay. Sorry for the technical difficulties. We're back, and I am just stepping through some slides that we had just gone through, but I'm getting back to our insight slide here. So I was going over some of the metrics that we see from automotive and some best practices, that the byproduct of trying to drive automotive ROI is that we learned certain things that we can plug into messaging. So what I was mentioning before was that the car color, blue tends to pop particularly well from a revenue perspective. Green actually pops very well, but in North America there aren't really that many green car options. But blue, being a common color, we do see a lot of success with that. Some of the other insights that we see in the place are interesting things like logo placement within an advertising unit. Of course, all units are different in terms of their shapes, but we can get a lot of insight in terms of what works and what doesn't work. For example, the northwest quadrant of a particular ad resonates well from an ROI perspective if the logo falls there. And then also some other things that we've learned is that messages that have pricing in them tend to resonate best. Messages that have an offer in them tend to not work so well. The only real exception is if there is a limited time offer, those messages tend to work better. So this is the type of information that you can play back into a deeper discussion around how to build ads. A no-brainer is to just go ahead and show the vehicle and make sure that people see the car in the ad. Again, that's a no-brainer, but some clients have used that again to make more sweeping decisions in terms of how they use their messaging. And then finally, calls to action. What are some of the calls to action that really drive activity? Configuring your own vehicle from a personalization standpoint tends to work. Shopping queue tends to work. Things like click here, where we still see a lot of in the industry, don't resonate as much. And a surprising one that was actually a big surprise for us was that search inventory tends not to resonate, whereas we had previously thought that is an excellent call to action. It's very retail focused. If you match that up to a person who we've seen conduct a lot of shopping activity, we from our hypothesis thought it would be a home run in terms of a call to action. And what we learned is in a lot of cases it doesn't work quite as well. So it's an opportunity for us to go back and really get a better understanding of how the calls to action work. And then finally, the most important one is really getting down to lift and driving ROI. And that is tying the ad exposure through data. So not only the data of how people target the ad, but how they interact with the brand and the shopping environment, matching that data up to the real-world opportunities, either within a customer's own database or through a third party who can measure offline sales capabilities, and driving that and showing of the tactics of what you engage in terms of audiences and messaging, what drives actual real-world ROI. And that goes back to focusing it on your business objectives. This can work in terms of new vehicle. It can also work in very interesting areas like driving service again, my earlier example through the life cycle, and showing the average size of repair order and driving against that. A little bit about the landscape. The other buzzwordy term that we talk about here is the concept of big data, and this is thrown around way too much in the space. But what we really mean about what big data means is understanding all of the data that you have, all of the data that's available about the consumer market, and understanding how to integrate it. And so basically it's combining it, integrating it so that you can make smart decisions with it, decisions you couldn't make before. It empowers you to make smarter decisions, or at least give you the opportunity to test them in bigger ways. And then next is really delivering on that, which is actually getting a message out in front of somebody based on those decisions. So it's one thing to be able to set the framework to make the decision. It's another one to make sure that you actually get out and talk to somebody with it. So that's critical. And then the last part of it is really the diagnostic component of data, which is understanding whether it worked and whether it didn't work. And in an environment where the machine does the work, being able to program the machine to make those decisions faster and faster and faster with that continuous input on what works and what doesn't work. A quick few examples of just key ways to do it. One is to use it to reach. You can get a pretty broad depth of reach with people, particularly around attitudinal areas. So you can drive big audiences at scale, and secondarily, by understanding the individual audience and letting the machine understand who they are and where they are, you can map more personalized messages. So in one part, it's really, really huge in terms of being able to scale to a big audience. But secondarily, you can really begin to hone down what message that big audience should see, and you can have lots of iterations of things based upon who those people are. Another is embracing cross-screen. This is critically important in the automotive space because lots of people use lots of different platforms when they're in their in-market phase for a vehicle. And obviously there are many pieces of research that a lot of the folks on the endemic side, that we do, that a lot of the big research houses do that have shown that. For example, in January of this year, the audiences that we see finally shifted to a majority mobile audience for the first time. And so we see people who use tablets and mobile and smartphones and desktop, and we see them in video and other environments. The critical thing here is that some recent research has showed that the number of vehicles a person considers continues to get smaller and smaller as time goes by. So at the point where somebody actually reaches out to a dealer to have a conversation, they've narrowed it down to just slightly over 2 vehicles. And so in that environment, all the consideration work is doing before they ever talk to a human being in the retail side of the business. And so understanding who those people are and following them from device to device and messaging to them is critical in that consideration phase, so that you can help influence that person to be more open-minded about your particular brand or your particular model or your particular location, retail location, in time. So being able to recognize that person across all these different touch points and craft a customized communication plan that messages in lockstep with where their shopping customer journey is going is really, really important, particularly in this space where we don't get to physically talk to them as easily as we once did. Another huge area is video, and that's scaling out. There are lots of areas in which to spend money in video today, and a key element of that is really understanding how it's driving your ROI. Video is heavily used, obviously, because of sight, sound, and motion to drive brand metrics. Understanding in real time how video is shifting consideration and favorability are very important. And so making sure that you have a brand ROI plan in place along with how you use video is very important. And then finally, it's measuring what matters. If we keep it as narrow as having a website for shopping for a vehicle, there are all sorts of things you can count. So one thing is narrowing it down to the things that matter. And a big part of that is taking all of those things and showing their relationship to actual real ROI, so that you're not optimizing on false signals. I mentioned before that we thought putting search inventory buttons in ads were a really great idea, but they didn't drive ROI. There was no core link to sales, but we thought that was really important. And by understanding what was working and what didn't work, it allowed us to reevaluate in a more real-time environment how you're able to message them in the correct way. The ecosystem, from a technology standpoint, it's big. Many of you have probably seen this before. This is a Lumascape chart that talks about all the people who work from a digital technology perspective in the marketing space. It's really, really huge with a lot of players who are either going in a business, out of business, or being merged and acquired at any given time. And so it's this massive moving map of information. So it's really, really important to have an understanding of who major players are and how to evaluate different players in different spaces. In general, how does this activation or exchange-based buying world work? There's a lot of plumbing, but on either ends of it, they're basically advertisers on the left-hand side who want to reach people, and audiences who are consuming content on the other side. And there are all sorts of data inputs that feed in through a number of different pipes that allow marketplaces to exchange advertising and for platforms to make decisions on whether or not to sell an ad or whether or not to buy an ad. And then at the end, there are all sorts of metrics that determine whether it worked well or whether it didn't work, so that in the next iteration in the cycle of advertising, that there's the opportunity to understand what worked and what didn't work. A quick view of how exchange buying works starts as simple as somebody's using a web browser, and they're surfing the web and they're using it. They go to a particular content site, and they request a page, and that may be on any of these publishers or any of the other billion pages that exist out there. That publisher makes a request to an exchange. If they haven't sold the inventory to an advertiser directly, they make the request to an exchange or exchanges to put that advertising opportunity out for bid. And so that bid request then goes to a series of platforms and databases that evaluate that opportunity. And basically a campaign is qualified. That campaign in the audience, that person at that web browser is evaluated based on their history. Where have we seen that person before? Did we see them at 7:30 and pass on the opportunity? And now it's 8 p.m. and now is the time that matters. If we know that, we can calculate a propensity score and calculate a bid based on the person's likelihood to turn into an ROI-bearing action. And so all that decision making is made. Other pieces of data are brought into the picture. So obviously, from a vehicle perspective, shopper data. People who are intending maybe a particular model or a particular segment, that comes into play in determining whether or not to go to the trouble to bid an ad. And secondarily, how valuable do we perceive this person to be? That calculates how much we should bid against them as well. So all of this data comes into play in lots of different ways. Financial data, for example, comes in and talks about a person's creditworthiness. And it may play a big role in what kind of financial offer message. Would it be a lease message? Should it be a buy message? All these different data points govern how things would work. But ultimately, a decision is made, a bid is placed, someone wins, then the ad goes back to the user, and if the user interacts with the ad, that gets added to the overall history. So the database gets bigger and bigger because it's another touch point. And obviously these happen billions of instances over the day. And databases get bigger, and theoretically, if programmatic's being employed the right way, databases get smarter about how they do all their decisioning. So that bidding process happens in about 1/3 of a second. So from the time the person calls up that page and that ad opportunity to the point where the ad shows up in front of them, it happens that quickly. So all of that plumbing that works in between happens just that quickly. And that's the power of the machine to do the decision making that the human can't do. All the sand is flowing through kind of this data funnel over time. All the sands on the earth counted twice that I talked about before. All of that processing is being done there. So it allows us to be more powerful and to do something we can't do as humans. Finally, talk a little bit about platforms. A lot of folks are moving to self-service models across the whole space. They want better control of their budget. They want to make frequent changes around timing and when to turn things on, when to turn things off. They may tactically want to change a lot of things. They may want to change their targeting quite frequently. And particularly in automotive, they have lots of different geographies, be they dealer trade areas, be they dealer association trade areas, that they have to be very mindful of. So a lot of people like to manipulate their geographies on an individual basis. And everybody has their existing partner list. I showed you that Lumascape. Everybody's got a different set of partners on there. And while a lot of those partners on that sheet all compete with each other, they all have to learn to collaborate with each other as well, because each one of them, from a client perspective, is going to have a different set of partners. So everybody has to be ready to integrate with everybody else for the most part. And then obviously a lot of programmatic is turnkey activation. It's a lot of workflow stuff. It's automating the manual Grimble process of getting things out the door so that the human can again focus more on things like business objectives and performance, and is the plan delivering against that. So everything from operations to trafficking to optimization to report generation. Humans spend less time worrying about reporting and worrying about applying the learning that the reporting gives them. And making sure that if programmatically the machine's making those decisions, that it's making them in a way that's driving ROI. So again, the human minds the machine to make sure that everything works appropriately. In terms of strengths, weaknesses, and opportunities and threats in this space, strengths programmatic, you get a lot of real-time visibility into what's working and what's not working, and how things are delivering. You get improved effectiveness across all the various digital channels that you maintain, or all the touch points, and even non-digital channels. And you learn a lot over time to better inform your campaigns, better inform your messaging, better inform your overall marketing. The weaknesses of it, I mean, there's a high activity and setup cost. To set up a campaign, particularly with an organization that hasn't done it before, there's a lot of upfront setup. Tagging, for example, is a huge upfront setup issue. Manual decision making, if you're not using all the functionality in programmatic, but still heavily doing things that the machine is designed to automate, that can use a lot of resource time. And a lot of folks may not have the analytical tools, they may not have the analytical resources to quite understand how to interpret everything. So that can be a weakness as well. These are things to look out for if you're planning on implementing more programmatic capabilities. The opportunities, the opportunity to treat campaigns and touch points as not as silos, but as a cross-platform optimization, that's huge. Honing creative messaging to better deliver on brand lift, that's huge. Using the technology from a private exchange perspective on content sites, allowing a portfolio of messaging to work. An example being if somebody's shopping for a sports car on a site and you let programmatic decisioning identify that person. Well, lots of people like to look at sports cars. And when I was, when I was a 12-year-old kid, if there wasn't internet, I would have been shopping sports cars all the time. A good programmatic interpretation of me as an individual would know not to show me a car ad. Whereas someone who is in market for a vehicle, it might be smart enough to realize that they're really interested as an enthusiast in a sports car, but really they're a truck intender. So a truck message is what should be put in front of them. That intelligence can add to the great value of a contextual shopping environment, but it can give it the extra oomph of intelligence about that user to understand what to message to them. And then you get overall increased effectiveness and performance out of the campaign as a whole. Again, the goal is tie it all to business objectives, and you should see that increase. Threats in the space, this stuff changes all the time. Technology innovates constantly, and so what is today's technology can be very out of date at times. And so understanding what the marketplace is at any given time and understanding how to future-proof what you're doing from a campaign perspective is very important. And then obviously, the more that people begin to take tools and maybe micro-segment campaigns, again, going back to that segmentation discussion, the cost of human ability can go back up again. The more tools you have, the more time you may want to spend with it. So being vigilant about allowing the machine to do what it's designed to do is very important. From a competitive advantage standpoint, being able to scale your data and get it out the door and understand how data drives business objectives and how employing it works, the faster you can do that, the better competitive advantage you have. The more intelligence that you can gain out of your campaigns about what works and what doesn't work is key and important. Automating it so that the machine constantly improves itself is one, but also taking the key learning and applying it to all your marketing efforts. Every consumer touchpoint you have, those learnings are very beneficial. And the faster you can learn more about how your audience and your customer is changing in real time, the better you can employ it across everything you do. So you can move with your customer base in more real time. And so the faster you can do that and the more thoroughly you can do that across channels, the greater competitive advantage that you'll have at any given time. Where programmatic is going from an advanced technology standpoint, really understanding who that consumer is and giving them that propensity score, that continues to evolve and get better and better. Not only in an active advertising environment, but using that propensity score to determine what channel. Should I reach one of my existing customers with digital advertising? Should I reach them with email? Or down to that individual level, am I more likely to have a message resonate with them with direct mail? And in an offline sense, is that a better place to go? And so you look at each one of those people, and every opportunity you have, whether digital or non-digital, to engage with them, you can score up an opportunity to decide how to reach out to them. So you're balancing your different channels. It's not just working within one channel with an audience. It's balancing them all together. And then finding the right kind of inventory and understanding what works. I mean, obviously, we want people who have a high propensity score. Chances are that most of the competitive marketplace will understand where that audience is as well, and they will bid up the marketplace. So it'll cost more money to reach good prospects. That's a bit of a no-brainer. But from a competitive standpoint, if you can be very good at evaluating the large pool of low propensity, low-cost inventory and doing constant testing, very frequent testing, automated testing, to be able to find that audience and find people who are going to turn into key prospects, if you're quick about it, you can have a competitive advantage by identifying that good market audience before the rest of the marketplace finds it. So again, if you can use the technology, the machine, to act faster, you have that competitive advantage. And then finally, it's really beginning to better understand and segment and build new segments about who your targets are. So instead of looking at people as vehicle intenders, break them into some key demographics. And this is a bit oversimplified, but you can look at people who are new vehicle buyers. You can look at people who are actively looking to purchase. We're looking at people who are looking to get out of the product they were in and into something new from a switcher perspective. And you can look at people who are your existing customers. And you can begin to not only recognize them in these separate groups, but you can understand how to treat them differently from a messaging perspective and from an interactive perspective. So you can begin to understand where they fall in the funnel at any given time and message appropriately, and also treat them separately. So again, it comes into more relevant messaging as time goes by. And where the future is on this, it's really inputting more data and more signals. So right now we use a lot of data around people who shop for vehicles, but we can roll in owner data. A lot of people are doing that now to complete their profiles, to better segment who they're talking to. But then there are lots of environmental factors that can come into play. What are fuel prices at any given time? What is the inventory available within that geographic region at any given time? What are the competitive activities that are going on? Who's spending a lot of money where? How does that affect the influence in the audience? And by adding more signals to the machine can do a better job of determining what messaging to put out in front of folks. Not only just in a digital environment, but what messaging should show up in store? What kind of pricing resonates with people at any given time? It's not just advertising metrics that can come into play here. All these different signals that really make up what the active automotive environment is at any given time can be pulled. Those levers can be pulled to do a better job of understanding where folks are at any given time. And then just kind of leave you with some action steps in terms of, if you're doing programmatic things today if you're planning on doing more in-depth programmatic things, maybe moving beyond search into some display areas, beyond display into more mobile-centric areas, beyond that into more video-centric areas. The key one is setting KPIs that tie to ROI. and measuring them. Set some benchmarks and always continuously seek to improve, and make sure that you're delivering on your objectives. Make sure that those KPIs that you have actually influence ROI. That's critical because you have to understand how the decisions that you're allowing the machine to do are relating to actual business performance. Making sure that it's part of the broader marketing campaign and that those objectives are pulled together, that's critical as well. Lots of testing. Activating marketing and media in different ways with different partners, understanding that big scope and understanding who offers the solution that matches up nicely against what you're trying to achieve from an objective standpoint. Tagging. You have to measure the people you're talking to and what they do and tying it to ROI because that's what's going to give you the learning, and it will also give you the opportunity to move forward and continuously seek to optimize. Centralizing that data and being able to apply a decisioning framework that allows you to actually activate it and put it in front of somebody, and then on top of that, learn what worked and what didn't work, and just continue that cycle of optimization to succeed. And then from a bigger perspective, it's not all about new vehicle sales. There is a life cycle of all sorts of things from finance to F&I to service to retention where these channels can be employed to really face off against an audience. And begin to mine revenue, mine the opportunity throughout the life cycle. So it's not all just new vehicles, and even within new vehicle, it's recognizing who your existing customer base is and how to treat them separately. And with working on that loyalty audience, you can find a lot of efficiencies because you don't have to reconvert them from scratch. And adding more channels, digital channels to that space, and also understanding what the right time and context is to talk to these people, that allows you to find a lot of those efficiencies. And with that, I'd like to say thanks. Appreciate your time. Thanks for sticking through some of the technical hiccups that happened about midway through this. My email address is here. I'm happy to go deep on any topics if you want to talk in more detail. Additionally, I'll be in the J.D. Power Automotive Marketing Roundtable Conference in Las Vegas at the end of this month or near the end of this month. I'll be out there as well, and I'm happy to chat if you're there. Always happy to just talk about the space, talk about any challenges, anything like that. I just like talking about programmatic and automotive, so it's always a lot of fun to do. And so with that, I'd like to say thanks again for your time. It is much appreciated, and I'll turn it back over for moderation to you, Phil.
Okay, thanks, Jason. Appreciate the presentation, and I also apologize to the audience for our technical glitches. But let's get to your questions. Daniel is asking what techniques we use to measure ROI. What are some techniques and tools that help us really get into the meat and potatoes of the ROI end of this equation?
I think it's obviously it's adding a lot of scoring and signals back into the picture. So if you think about it, I mean, if we're talking about new vehicle sales, it's as simple as being able to say, did it actually turn and sell a car? And that obviously, depending on the complexity and the sophistication of the data pipes being connected, that can be done within an internal platform, the marketer's internal platform, and so you can tie your advertising and marketing investment into where we recognize and see that those prospects turn into new vehicle owners. You can also validate it, obviously, with, say, a Polk or a J.D. Power type approach where you're taking a third party and having them measure the effectiveness from an ROI perspective, tying to overall sales that your campaigns delivered. So you can measure offline sales that way. I'd say some of the more sophisticated things that we're seeing today is, in addition to did it sell a car, is passing back another score, which is really saying something to the effect of, did this not only sell a car, but it sold a car with a high contribution margin? And we have a score, say, I'm simplifying, but I'll say we have a score from 1 to 10, with 10 being highly valuable and 1 being low value. It begins to train the system to not only identify people who are going to buy a car, but to identify people who are going to buy a car that has a lot of margin associated with it. So you're finding more higher value customers in addition to finding customers in general. So those are some of the things that we see from an ROI perspective today.
Okay. Paul is asking, as a marketer, I would want to make sure that my ad is served on a brand-safe website and or video. How can we make sure our programmatic buys are also going to be brand safe?
Yeah, and obviously that's not only brand safe, but data safe. You're paying a lot of money to someone to run advertising where, in a world, they're not only collecting data about the consumer, but they're collecting that data about you. You're paying to run advertising to inform the model around what sells a lot of vehicles. And so if that's the case, how can you, if that's the case, are people treating your data as your data, for example? And so not only are you in a site that is safe for the consumer and your brand, but also how do you protect what you've paid to cultivate? So a couple things. Obviously making sure that there are very firm walls around data usage. That's one key one. And on the brand side, making sure that whoever you're working with as a partner has their own internal framework for being able to filter out what brand safe content is and isn't, but also have the flexibility to add any third party. There are lots of people who specialize in qualifying brand safe content. As many different layers as you can put on it that help to better filter that marketplace, you will be in a more brand safe environment.
All right, this is from Howard. How much more effective is programmatic buying versus buying site direct on endemic sites? Seems you would have more. Seems like you would have more qualified prospects on automotive endemic sites than spending money on programmatic, where a CPL can be high.
Yeah, I mean that's key. In terms of the endemic sites. I mean, and in programmatic, endemic sites are critically important in the overall stream of things. Obviously, contextually, that's where everyone's going to research a vehicle, to find product on the ground, to hear what other people are saying about it. I mean, contextually, there's great value in that. I think where programmatic comes into play is, I mentioned the sports car with the pickup truck and tender example. If you can apply more data to those shoppers who are shopping at any given time, you can put a better, more effective message in front of it. So think of it as you have a great start in a great contextual environment with a great audience. Layering a programmatic technology on top of that will allow you to better determine what vehicle to put in front of them, and not only what vehicle, but what's the key messaging. If they're conquest, how do you message against the conquest vehicle? If they're segment, how do you talk about the segment leading elements of that vehicle? How do you get smarter about what to message that person in that environment? And realistically, what you'll see is, if your cost per leads are on the higher end of the scale, because you're paying more to get a higher quality audience, better decisioning and messaging should, A, increase the number of KPIs that you're driving, say lead generation is it, but secondarily, being smarter about how to put the right message in front of that right person, you should see an increase in efficiency in terms of the cost per lead over time as well. So it's really using more decisioning technology on top of an already really, really good placement strategy.
All right, this is from Daniel. Where does RocketFuel fit into the whole ecosystem here?
The ecosystem is, it's interesting. RocketFuel is one part a data activation, or excuse me, an advertising activation platform. So we go to the exchange marketplace and we leverage all sorts of various data in the automotive sense, and I'll use retail automotive, to identify and market intenders and put campaigns in front of them and prove out through an analytics perspective that we drive ROI. So we're definitely out there trying to acquire and trying to consistently learn about how to better drive performance for a client. Where it goes from there is we also have data management services that allow for all the onboarding of that massive set of data and put decisions against it. And they can be activated through all sorts of other channels. And so that comes into play where we partner with lots of other people based on who our clients are about how to put things out. Other people might use a different platform for display advertising. So we handle decisioning and provide that information out to that platform that activates digital, and all the actual activation that happens elsewhere. We could work with, for example, an email vendor or a direct mail partner and help the decisioning about this audience gets an email and this audience gets a direct mail because we perceive it to be more effective. And those individual firms do the activation as well. So we play a role in the advertising world, but we play a big role in the data aggregation and decisioning component as well.
Terrific. From Peter, how is RocketFuel participating in the mobile programmatic space, which he says is a cookieless environment?
Yeah, in a lot of the mobile programmatic space, it is definitely a cookieless environment. And it's really being more predictive in scoring, so using an algorithm to better tie in, particularly, for example, around cross-device marketing, to tie the individual mobile consumer to another platform, a video platform or a display platform where we may run across them on the web. It's really using the algorithm to determine the links on who a relevant consumer is in the mobile space, and then bearing it out based on performance factors. So again, tying it to ROI. And it's also heavily in the areas where we can identify where people are, so in-app environment, where we have a little bit more power to be able to recognize where somebody is geographically, to pull some levers that maybe we wouldn't pull, where we buy third-party data on intenders, but in an app environment we actually physically see where somebody is. With proximity to a dealer trade area, or people who have competitively shopped on other dealer lots. So it's one part a constricting environment, but it's one part an enlightening environment that gives you tools that you don't get in a space like desktop.
All right. From Trevor, what are your thoughts about behavior targeting on the GDN and paying per click versus programmatic and paying CPM?
Oh, sorry. Behavioral targeting, obviously there are lots of opportunities to buy all sorts of behavioral data and employ in different ways. And in the automotive marketplace, there are all types. And obviously there is often what is called the pay-per-click approach, although pay-per-click approach is exactly it. You're paying per click. What you want to do is do as much test and learning as you possibly can. Automating that gives you advantages to test and learn faster. But the idea being that all these different behavioral data points that you find, there will be a lot of them that won't work really well at all. But there will be nuggets in there that when aggregated together, they will drive a lot of ROI. The question is, can you recognize it fast enough and employ the right pieces of data fast enough so that you haven't run 90% of your campaign while you're still learning? So the real-time component of those types of data and bringing them to bear is really important to make sure that you're driving that ROI performance.
Okay, last question here from Doug. What is the definition of an in-market auto shopper? And with a programmatic campaign, can it be determined what % of the target audience reach was in-market? If so, how?
If you begin by taking kind of a scientific approach to the marketplace in terms of determining what an in-market person is. If they're in an endemic site, well, clearly, by definition, their behavior makes them an in-market shopper. What you want to seek to do, and this goes for all the other channels, programmatic, exchange-based media, and the other place where you can play, you have a pretty good hypothesis, for example, that those people are in market. What you need to do is very quickly test that and get a firm understanding of whether or not it's true. And it goes back to on the in-market sites, there are some people who are just browsing or looking at enthusiast vehicles. If you can recognize who is who very quickly, you can refine in real time what the definition of in-market is. You can say, okay, well, on this page I start with 100% of people in an in-market contextual environment, but perhaps through data and performance evaluation, we find that only 80% of those people are actually intending a vehicle at this time. So you've now redefined your in-market category to something smaller. Same thing goes if you're in the exchange environment. You start with a very broad target if you're starting from scratch. You have your own research, your past history, all those things. So you start with a very big pool. Well, you'll very quickly find out that of those 100% of people, well, suddenly now only 3% of them are relevant. And so what you again want to do is learn very quickly and define it down to that audience to make sure that you're efficiently spending what you're doing and that you're reaching as much of a likely to act audience as possible, whether that action is buying a vehicle or that action is changing an attitudinal metric. You want to put, for example, in brand video, there are a lot of people who fall within the pickup truck segment, but that's a pretty passionate segment. And what you want to learn when you're targeting those folks and those intenders, you want to learn as quickly as you possibly can who hates your brand, who has the Calvin peeing on your logo people, and you want to remove them from consideration. So you're redefining in real time what in-market really means.
All right. Well, this has been a great presentation, and that brings us here to the end of our webinar. Thanks again to today's audience for the questions and for your patience with our technical glitches. If you asked a question that we didn't get a chance to answer, RocketFuel will follow up with you by email. If you learned something from this